You know, I don't know what the deal is about Brazoria. Okay, I'm in Pearland, Texas, okay, which is actually Brazoria. I refer to Brazoria Country probably more so than Brazoria County for the mere sake of a biblical scripture spirit of adoption and the Y2K of 94 and paper made and 56 is 10 is 94 and the annotated adoption and abortion, and you know the thing about the row spelled with a W being 61 in miracle in the news as compared to the ROE being 38. And so like as far as like legal media goes, and you know some you know alphanumeric value that might present maybe a you know the idea of like maybe a something other than you know a miracle. Oh yeah. So like I thought I'd include maybe the W if it gets to the point real quick about the Roe v. Wade. I'm trying to really kind of stay away from it, but you know it's kind of like thinking about Brazoria being like 90 and Columbia Pictures and one person of Columbia being like a Colombian or the alphanumerics of 90. This is Brazoria, okay? I've mentioned it like several times. You know, like just because I'm in a bank doesn't mean I'm a Colombian. Just because I'm one person in Brazoria doesn't mean I'm a Colombian. It seemed to be really the issue ultimately that Brazoria is almost, I'm kind of like wondering if it's represented as a geographic deal about, you know, North American high schools, or Columbia Pictures representing some idea of the District of Columbia in the way of Washington, D.C. on a continental level, if not region level. So, you know, it's kind of like thinking about that, you know, heard all that talk, you know, years ago back in high school, be cool, stay in school. The thing with this is that, you know, I mean, ultimately, you know, the thing about, you know, high school seemed to be really the issue. And I'm kind of like, you know, thinking about whether or not if Brazoria is just representing the idea of Washington, D.C. in like virtually every high school, or some degree level as maybe not degree level as Columbia Pictures. And it's kind of like almost like Columbia Pictures impersonating the thought of like a degree level of like the Statue of Liberty, presenting, you know, the European standard. Yet, you know, the thing with this is that the Eurodollar is seen to be really kind of like the issue beyond high school or Columbia Pictures representing Region 1, and how true that is, if that's really limited to the idea of like the District of Columbia being some idea of Columbia Pictures impersonating, you know, the Statue of Liberty, and the difference between corporate business law or the thought of maybe a degreed or non-degreed issue in that way. And it's kind of like, you know, I want to make it clear, you know, that my thing is like, you know, hey, you know, as far as I'm concerned, you know, kind of, not really as far as I'm concerned, the thing with this is that, you know, I feel like, you know, like I'm a drum major of like major universities of, you know, around the entire world, not limited to the names that are identified of like major universities, normally sometimes identified in most King James Version Bibles. Yet at the same time, it's kind of like the Book of Mormon and the American thing. It's kind of like it really presents the issues like it seemed to be really involving the drum major. And, you know, my name is Wade, okay, and getting to the alphanumerics of 213 Arian kinds of that, and some idea, there would maybe some idea of like the kernel as a partition representing Columbia Pictures, or the thing about what seemed to be, you know, Trump's own words about extreme vetting beyond the thought of maybe a Chevrolet Corvette or a telekinetic roll of the pen that might maybe identify maybe a K-9 unit as like high school, as a high school level of like the District of Columbia. And it seemed to be the geographics that would even present Region 0 as seemed to be like involving the idea of like the Eurodollar as partially of the symbolic representation on the backside of the US $1 bill. Yet it identifies, you know, through, you know, analytically and symbolically and alphanumerically, you know, the backside of the US $1 bill between the C and the PTIS, that symbolic representation. It identifies, you know, a 90 degree that ultimately is the EE and the different design E in calculus that goes into quantum, and it's they both look the same, but the one in quantum has the structure that calculus does not. And it seemed to be the issue, really. I mean, if it's really getting to be a geographical issue, if Brazoria is representing the District of Columbia as Columbia Pictures, some idea of like whether or not if Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes is the only idea of a multiple choice as far as like a non-agreed issues like intellectual duration or having fair use in the way of 1 cycle per second above the letter N in Latin terminology below the equator in its own like domain of like, the United States is region 1 presenting the region 0 issue, that even center point energy is obviously, presented the issue, yet it's the Eurodollar is region 1 and region 2, or the one word in the book of Thessalonians being the transfiguration, Alpha Americus 192, applied to Anuit Comptus. Actually, I think that is the Alpha Americus of 204, based upon that symbolic representation being the Alpha Americus of 58. And like Anuit being 79, the C being 3, and the symbolic representation 58, and the PTIS being 64. It's like 204 minus 192 being transfiguration being 12. Just looking at, it's like pi r squared, and the E equal MC squared of like 12 in region 1 and region 2, including the Eurodollar that way, combining Washington, D.C. with some like alphanumeric symbolic and analytical, attachment of the Eurodollar on the left side being some haloed idea that through, like going beyond the alphanumerics of 58, only one more would be 59, and the thing about it being at a 90 degree, presenting the EE that's identified as the European standard and the symbolic representation on the backside of the US $1 bill, giving that impression that way, even the 240% in pawn shop representing some idea of a minimum requirement. It seemed to be of the European standard, but it's American as the Eurodollar is pronounced, and it sounds like as the Eurodollar being like the US dollar, and a standard used in like North America of commercial venue of living quarters of an international electronic engineering standard. I believe it's only appliances, but I think it's the thing about, commercial venue of living quarters are not affected by television programming or deed restrictions or carbon footprints, absentee voting, or like, mechanics liens, in that way. And it seemed to be the thing about, Brazoria is kind of like, if it's really the idea of what really goes on, as compared to a degree level of like, really I would say, really a minimum of a bachelor's at a major university. Associates is one thing, but, still serving milk and cookies in an international law firm is pretty much, an associate's degree is automatically in my mind like the state of grace, like the American Bar Association. It's almost like the state of grade issue as an associate's in need of a higher education is really ultimately what it gets to in my mind anyway. As some idea of the state of grace, an associate's degree in need of a higher education, and ultimately it really seemed to be really exactly that, really. In any case, so like it seemed to be the thing about, Brazoria being some geographic icon, representing the U.S. dollars, the District of Columbia as the face value of money. Yet, like it's like grandfathered corporate law of retroactive presidential administration that seemed to be really the issue, and the one word it seemed to be really involving the wooden buffalo nickel and the word hidden. And it's really the escrow issue of real estate, and how the word hidden, the alphanumerics of 44, big formula 44, and even Japanese being 71 in Pearland, reading, Japanese from top to bottom. Or in my case, what seemed to be, the idea of like auditing legal media is like the like my camera lens, the camera eye on my phone, recording audio, and it's streaming with the signal strength and the factors of like signal strength based upon the tone of my voice, as well as the decibel range, and it picks up the sensitivity and like identifies vocal pronunciation in a way of signal strength, yet it's streaming from top to bottom. And that's the thing about quantum, is that not they just turn my phone, automatically equates to like quantum. It's not necessarily that, although that is a practical application and principle of auditing legal media as far as like the digital signal processing speed. That involves, a little bit more, and involving like live on air auditing, as compared to just like turning my phone sideways, like a landscape instead of a portrait at a 90 degree, like what it is like right now, and like watching audio, stream from top to bottom, like Japanese being 71 in Pearland. And the thing about quantum is that the Japanese seem to be only two of the, what is considered to be two of the 22 alphabetical letters of Japanese that are actually, if I'm not mistaken, the actual letters that are used in formative computation in quantum, with that different design E. Yet the thing about the backside of the US $1 bill is that it's the information is there. It's kind of like the pi r squared. It's kind of like the formula works. And that's the thing about just knowing that there's more to it than what is actually like visible. Sometimes even staring at it and not realizing something like maybe language as compared to like the difference between like, you know, reading English from left to right as compared to reading Japanese from top to bottom. It's kind of like hidden in the way, and it seemed to be the deal about escrow and alphanumerics of 78 and involving real estate, or the thought of like litigation de facto, or de facto itself being used as an easement of lifespan, only identifying intellectual property as lifespan. What that is in appreciation or depreciation in like real estate as compared to commercial venue of living quarter. And that's the thing that I'm kind of like thinking about as far as Brazoria. It's kind of like, you know, it's kind of like the syndrome of, you know, Columbia like being an impersonator of like the Statute of Liberty and the difference between corporate and business law, or actually how family law is actually used at a degree level and degree plan, like combining, you know, student loan with a Pell Grant, false granting and adoption in a way that presents the presence that's so, I mean, very much about, you know, family law, yet it presents ultimately what seems to be, you know, monopolizing capitalization as a method of banking. And the thing about Columbia Pictures is that, you know, the similarities of like Columbia Pictures is the thing about the Statue of Liberty. Ultimately, in my mind, you know, like a hockey puck and a Swiss Klondike bar, like, you know, the HTTP : // in that way. The thing with this is that, you know, it kind of like, it gets to the, you know, it's kind of like, hey, I think that really, I'm like a drum major of like major universities, beyond the thought of maybe even an associate's degree. And, you know, all the time it seemed to be, you know, involved with like linguistic and alphanumerics and all that stuff. It seemed to be like one of the only real degrees that is not really like taught on campus. Linguistics is, but really it's not in any degree involving linguistics at any major university that I've seen as far as available information goes. Obviously a direct issue of like networking. Based upon what I've seen, that even linguistics at, you know, a major university at a minimum of a bachelor's degree, and, you know, the idea of even a master's, is that linguistics, I haven't seen it in any kind of combine that really gets into the symbolic and analytical that seem to be involving like a Stargate program or a combine of available information, like the Boolean chart of like principles of digital audio and sequencing characterization and statistics compared to maybe, you know, the HTTP : and identifying, you know, instead of sequencing characterization, it's just for normally of like a computer programming and language of architecture platform embedding encryption, or applying, you know, some information that would identify, you know, the thought of maybe of a delta force being like some schematic symbol of a triangle, or the pi r squared being, you know, like a 6-point star. Ultimately, you know, an E = MC squared, and you're looking right at it, and it's kind of like, do you recognize an E = MC squared in the difference between one triangle and two triangles, or the Star of David and the Israeli flag? And ultimately, it seemed to be the Ocean 2 thing that seemed to be identifying, you know, factor between the history of the U.S. dollar and the book Secrets of the Temple, How to Put Observance of the Country, identifying, you know, some religious issue in Latin America. And it seemed to be, you know, ultimately getting to like a black color code of like constitutional law, and like state statutes annotated that link that one word, repudiation, between warehousing and real estate, and how escrow seemed to be the thing about the word hidden, or even Vicksville in the 44. And it seemed to be the only deal about the wooden buffalo nickel that way. And, you know, the word wooden with one D is like 76, like capital, okay. And with like 2 Ds, it's like 80, you know, like an answer. And with like 3 Ds, which seem to be the isometric value of volume of actual participation, the 3D is in the word wooden being like 84 lumber. Yet the coffee seems to be the deal between McDonald's Golden Arches and the wooden buffalo nickel. And it's almost the difference between, you know, a commercial venue in GMC, like referring to the commercial as advertisement, raising the I-beam, raising the bar. It's clearly, you know, the I-beam of the metal, the iron, and like the commercial venue and high-rise and structure of metal and not wood really at all. The thing with this is that monetary domestic kind of is like segregated in that way. In my mind, it's like automatically suppression and loss prevention of the FDIC claims as a method of banking, and the difference between corporate and business law that way. The thing about, Brazoria being like 90, or one person, maybe the thought of maybe as high school, I mean, it seemed to be that whether or not if Brazoria is representing the idea of like Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, representing every high school, in this case, Pearland, Texas, being like the Alphamex 175, In God We Trust, or a telepathic Air Force, or, the Alphamex 175, or, a telepathic capital. In any case, so it seemed to be that whether or not if Brazoria is the syndrome of actually being like Pearland, Texas, or the Alphanumerics itself being 140, or attenuation, which seems to be the deal, in between, like, from the ip pluribus UN, the banner, and the equals beak, like UN being like Los Angeles, and UN being like the University of Miami, and it seemed to be the color codes of Los Angeles geographically, including UCLA, and the similarities of the Miami Dolphins, and the degree of digital signal processing speed of, special effects and waveform as compared to just frequency itself. Yet, the frequency of impedance being like, the pastel red, and the ambience of like a pastel green. It's like the colors of like night vision, involving, the thing about night vision, or Abraham Lincoln Night Vision Shuttle Government Stargate program. And going through something like that, and realizing, that ultimately it had gotten to, only because of a memory issue for a 6 to a 9 month period, really seemed to be now really at this point like a 1 year period. And the difference between a kind of like trying to account for everything during a 6 to a 9 month period, and even far beyond, probably any ability really other than the mind's eye of a military bureau to determine. Maybe a total complete 1 year period. So I mean, so ultimately, when memory became my awareness that had been a phenomenally huge issue, and then like We International was like the thing about it, and that's when I really started calling it a Stargate program, an Abraham Lincoln Night Vision Shuttle Government Stargate program, realizing that memory had been, far beyond, the deal of what would be some idea of a regular circuit going beyond the Bluebird bus into, the Airbus H-160, and how human capital seemed to be the deal about being itemized going through a circuit. And, like I was put like on an Airbus, and it seemed to be that song, somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds fly. And the thing about, Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, and Kansas City being one of the major cities, one of the 12 Federal Reserve banks. And the thing with this is that, that ultimately, the thing about that, it seemed to be that somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds fly is about the Airbus in my mind, the Airbus H-160. It is a helicopter that as a presidential and military and private, it's identified as those three of its use as presidential and military and the private sector of that. And the thing with it seemed to be the thing about one of the 12 Federal Reserve banks in Kansas City, and the movie, Wizard of Oz, and somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds fly, about, the Inuit Coptis over the, the eye over the pyramid, and, something about that equation, Inuit Coptis minus transfiguration, the one and only word in the book of Thessalonians about, after the third day of the resurrection, and like going to Mount Olives, which is a plateau, and from the plateau of Mount Olives ascending into the sky and re-entering heaven, and that one word being transfiguration applied to Inuit Coptis being 12, or region 1 and region 2, or the US dollar and the euro dollar. I mean, it's as realistic as it gets. It seemed to be the difference between identifying factor between like Brazoria being like, now it seemed to be the thing about Columbia pictures in high school yearbooks, or the thought, Columbia pictures presents themselves that what gives the similarities of the Statue of Liberty, but it's not. Okay, this is Pearland, Texas. Okay, I'm not Colombian, I'm not Latin. I mean, like born in Houston, Texas. But, the thing about carbon footprints, absentee voting, mechanics lanes, and the idea of like, considerable amount that really seemed to be, the idea involving like America Free Trade Act and North Atlantic Peace Treaty Organization, and the deal about, absentee voting, or the thought of like litigation de facto res habeas corpus, only what lifespan means as an easement of intellectual, some idea of property. You've probably seen, like football players are normally identifying, their jerseys like property of the Dallas Cowboys, and football players are kind of like known to be, some of the ones that are identifying, they themselves as like property of, something like, a football team. Presenting the human capital factor about, something other than what seemed to be the kernel involving, a partition. And really the thing about what high school yearbooks only seem to be about, ultimately in Brazoria being some idea of a canine unit, is really what it seemed to be, really, beyond the Chevrolet Corvette, the veterinarian, the Corvettinarian, and even Trump's own words of like extreme vetting. And, it's kind of like my name, okay? It's kind of like WadeASVPriddy being Alpha Merchants 213, or Chevrolet Silverado, the Z71 thing, or telepathic brainwaves, or Galveston County, and the Z71 of Galveston County, or the area code 213 of Los Angeles. Yet Aryan Skynes Latin, it's kind of like it's kind of like, my name being like Wade, and some idea of a vice president network. It's kind of like, maybe I may have been maybe blind and naive to, the way it's really been about my name. I mean, and it's just that I just happen to be the one that has my name, okay? And I never really thought of it as, anything other, might get some similarities to the Navy, okay? Or, something about the front lines of the beachfront. Many people might not automatically think of a vice president network, or the idea of like, Jesus setting new for the foundations of the earth as a religion that normally doesn't even identify alphanumerics like the alphanumerics is 64 or Israel or an American, or have that connectivity based upon Israel being like some like homeland of the Lord Jesus Christ being born, and all that good stuff about the three wise men, and all that stuff as Bethlehem, and some idea that originate as some idea of Christianity in Israel. And not knowing anything about alphanumerics might not automatically think that, although it might be an assumption, whether they know anything about alphanumerics or not, that, I mean, that really normally isn't the issue, but seemingly it really has been the issue, in a way that, based upon my experience, that has, been, the idea of whether or not absentee voting or carbon footprints or mechanics liens, not limited to Christianity or religion itself as a category, but a degree level that seemed to be, even involving like trading energy and center point energy, giving the impression that the Eurodollar has some haloed, symbolic representation on the backside of the US $1 bill in the form of the International Electronic Engineering, identifying that little haloed left side that ultimately is only 58 until it gets to, the thing about, the field scope and range and the accuracy on that little haloed left side that presents, a 9-degree would be, just a haloed left side of it. And between the C and the PTIS has ultimately got to like a 9-degree, and, the field scope and range, kind of like the accuracy of what would maybe look like maybe a plus sign, or, one of the older scopes. Yet center point energy presents like the laser, yet the frequency identifying like a delta force at a 90-degree is a perpendicular spot, or even a center point energy issue like of the accuracy of a laser beam. Or the top view being ultimately, like a cone or a pylon, and the deal about the 7-point crown of the Statue of Liberty. The designs have changed, several times about the Statue of Liberty, but somewhere between like Columbia Pictures presenting what gives the similarities of appearance as the Statue of Liberty really seemed to be an issue here in Brazoria County, that maybe being, maybe naive, or, the thing about E equal MC squared, or pi r squared, or, something about alphanumerics being, the alphanumerics of like the word itself being 140 in parallel sexes, and ultimately, with like USA attached to anything of 140 in parallel sexes, being alphanumerics 181, Houston, Texas Electronic Power, WIA International Selective Service, and, the deal about WIA International being like Warner, Electra, and like Atlantic. And it presents the connectivity between Columbia Pictures and Washington, D.C., and, deal about, high school. It seemed to be really kind of like a little bit more. My thought of being, really my thought of being beyond high school, is my issues that really, I don't think it's because I'm in a bank experiencing all kinds of stuff, because I'm on supplemental security income, talking all this talk about, misappropriation, allocation of Mississippi being some idea of the ISS and the SSI and the PPI, or the ISS and the SSI being international superstar or supplemental security income, or International Secret Service and supplemental security income or superstar intelligence. Although it seemed to be a thing, like even with my drum set, the Prohibition VSX, I'm working on getting the Strata Blue, what you see me on my channel at WadeASVPriddy, PRDDY, which is actually a total of 35 pieces, okay? That's a double bass drum set, including all my hardware, percussion, special effects, cymbals, and all that stuff, okay? And really, you know, the thing with this is that it ultimately gets to the idea of, you know, whether or not if the District of Columbia is using Brazoria as an easement, representing more so of high school than degree level, or some idea of what, you know, controlled issues have really presented as some idea of whether or not if a boycott embargo is only a practical application, this similar, based upon practical application of principle of like purgatory, about waiting, yet, I mean, you know, who you kidding? I mean, is it really ultimately getting to the idea of like a novice attempt to have a relationship, or some deal about some black statue as a black bird? And I mean, the movie, you know, the Ten Commandments is ultimately getting to some idea of a pagan idolatry and some novice idea of what relation means in Babylon and Pearland, Texas, Alpha America 71. Or some idea like, you know, foster granting and adoption is like a combined of like, you know, a student loan combined with a Pell Grant. It's almost like, you know, foster granting the idea that seemed to be ultimately in my mind all the way up, you know, between what seemed to be, you know, the thing about the west side of Houston of Chase and Capitol, even 3D International, or something about the World Trade Center, I mean, even represents in my mind of like combining a student loan with a Pell Grant. And it's almost like the idea of like foster granting and adoption, what seemed to be the difference between, you know, whether or not that's going to be some idea of an acceptance speech, or the idea of monopolizing capitalization, and the presence in family law presents the issue of like, you know, who knows anyway? I mean, is that just a classroom? And that's like really going on, and it's like not even realizing that some idea of like relation is like some idea of family law in the classroom, and like no one has anything to say about it. Is really what it's getting to, or just having that knowledge of that information. And then there's the publishers of the high school yearbook issue that maybe aren't even involved at an educational facility beyond high school, yet maybe not of a university, yet likewise in addition, is the way I see even an associate's degree, even on a major university. I mean, if it's not a bachelor's degree on a major university, I mean, all an associate's degree in my mind at an international level is only the idea of a state of grace. I mean, really, even an associate's degree just seems to be the excuse, yet not the excuse of the state of grace. An associate's degree in need of a higher education being some idea of the American Bar Association. I mean, in an international law firm, I mean, you know, I think, you know, some associate's degree might maybe go beyond maybe serving, you know, donuts and coffee in the morning at an international law firm, okay? I mean, if that's the idea of state of grace, is, you know, some, you know, maitre d' at a golf course, you know, representing some idea of like a international financial management at an international, you know, law firm, or some idea of a maitre d', as some courtesy effort is a state of grace being, you know, escorted to, you know, maybe milk and cookies with Annette Penicello, you know, codifying law, or some idea, you know, like the state of grace is, you know, an associate's degree, you know, serving maybe donuts and coffee at an international law firm, or some idea of the state of grace is, you know, I mean, for real, okay? And it seemed to be whether or not the Brazoria has really been representing virtually everything, you know, and I haven't heard a word, really not about any of it, but it seemed to be really been happening. I mean, even recognizing some of the issues that's been involved, seem to be really not ignoring them now, is really what it is. I mean, even knowing and even participating and not even realizing that if it's an accusation of participation or just experiencing some idea in that way, or even recognizing the television in that way, or what auditing legal media only seems to be, whether or not if ultimately it seems to be if Washington D.C. is representing the District of Columbia as a high school yearbook, or Columbia Pictures impersonating the Statue of Liberty between, you know, the Eurodollar and the U.S. dollar, Region 1 and Region 2, is a new compass minus Transfiguration being 12, or, you know, some idea of like the truth, or, you know, a miracle God. as compared to the exact opposite being 78 of like zip codes and like a hard God and Robert and escrow seem to be the big deal about, you know, the idea that escrow is almost like a factor of like human capital as a heartbeat of America. Is hopefully what it seemed to be is a factor of escrow representing a hard God and the alphanumerics of 78 in that way as some idea of like, you know, signal strength. In any case, so like I kind of been thinking about that because it's already going on like 30 minutes and like 25 seconds right now. And my thing about, you know, being some idea like a major university and you know, I'm on supplemental security income, okay, and I have been for like quite some time. You know, going on, you know, probably more than 10 years now, really. The thing with this is that I've done quite a bit about the linguistic alphanumerics and what seemed to be only involving more so of a Stargate program on a symbolic and analytical way. And it seemed to be like even, you know, the idea of like Columbia Pictures representing like anyone in the bank is still potentially in high school. Whether that's just the only idea of a publisher beyond high school itself, or maybe as an option as the freedom of speech and freedom of press, and you know the who knows anyway forum really is really what it really even ultimately gets to in the Bureau of Vital Statistics, and what that really seemed to be of absentee voting, or the thought of maybe the only idea of the Columbia Pictures impersonating a degree level, yet presents the non-degreed, non-transferable, non-negotiable, non-transferable idea of like non-degreed as the District of Columbia as some idea of like some on part, you know, putt-putt golf course, and it seemed to be really that ultimately that it seemed to be really whether or not that the whole entire accusation of the U.S. dollar on face value representing Washington D.C. as the District of Columbia, yet D.C. in my mind is automatically the dimensional clause and the direct circuit. Not really the District of Columbia at all. Yet it presents the immediate, like, I mean, entire geographical area and everything I'm talking about. It seemed to be involving that book, Sick as a Temple, How the Federal Reserve Runs the Country. And I mean, the real issue between, like, Columbia Pictures and some idea in my mind of Brazoria representing, you know, like, high schools worldwide. As a publisher, American Family Publishers Clearinghouse Sweepstakes, are you kidding me? How could it be so? I mean, you mean, is that really what American Family Publishers Clearinghouse Sweepstake is really what I'm talking about, like, right now? And there's a winner? Well, that's really good to know, yeah. So I guess I'll know when I know. The thing with this is that really, I mean, if ultimately, really a degree level is some idea of, like, it overrides some idea of, like, which normally, in my mind, automatically involving linguistic and alphanumerics, and it's like the acronym of degrees, and the real issue of like acronyms at a degree level seem to be really the big deal about, you know, whether or not if a circuit's going to be the idea of the experience or what participation is or is not, or don't be fooled by imitations, or the deal about ultimately getting to the idea of like you know, U.S. patents, copyrights, and trademarks as compared to the thought of maybe, you know, constitutional laws of freedom of speech and freedom of press, having the right to assemble kind of like thing. You know, really, ultimately, it seemed to be whether or not if you know, Brazoria County, it's only Brazoria being alphanumerics of 90 or one person, it represents maybe only a U.S. $1 bill as one person, and like everyone in North America in a bank is considered potentially a Colombian, and I'm not Colombian. It's not that I have to be, you know, academically prejudiced. I mean, but really, who's trying to kid who? I mean, is that considered privilege? I mean, is the word privilege, you know, really at all? But I believe that in the King James Version Bible, that the come privilege that's identified as two words normally doesn't identify as that it's a legal issue involving law. Privilege is normally identified as some attorney-client privilege, and some issue that decides whether or not if anything, you know, questionable would be maybe only the issue of knowing or not knowing, how deed restrictions are used or not as legal media, and ultimately it seemed to be whether or not if anyone knows, like the who knows anyway form of whether, you know, just being in a bank or some idea of maybe some idea of maybe a potential sole proprietor that doesn't even know that maybe potentially endorsing an entire history of employment would only represent some idea, as maybe a 1099 that was like never even identified as a sole proprietorship, only an endorsement as some idea as a method of banking. Maybe through neglect based on lack of experience might be the idea of intellectual property, having fair use but not claiming ownership of the rights in the event of an actual emergency. You would have been told where to tune into, right? And only based upon that fact is, like intellectual property, the way it really is about international law. It's like some idea of like intellectual property, having fair use, but not claiming ownership of the rights seems to be, the never-ending issue about, favoritism that, like, many people might not even know about. That kind of favoritism seems to be, the idea of whether or not if a Stargate program is the only idea of maybe, cost-effective. That it seemed to be ultimately, like me in here in the tent, it seemed to be like YouTube.com presenting the issue of like whether or not if Brazoria is representing a high school and the District of Columbia as some idea, some like dimensionally claused, idea of like who's in control of who based upon what information, and what seemed to be the only idea that degreed information seemed to be, what really always matters. So, like, whether or not if it's alphanumeric, linguistic, or symbolic and analytical, based upon, how a circuit really is, and ultimately, everyone has a television, whether they recognize it as a Stargate program or just a circuit, or either one of them. I mean, ultimately, it's kind of like, it's like everyone's just like looking at it in their own home, and really, ultimately, just turning television on, or K television, or even W television seem to be really the issue of a deed restriction. Automatically just turn the television on, or absentee voting, or carbon footprint, or mechanics lien, or some idea as a deed restriction. Just let me just turn the television on is ridiculously, like so far beyond like not cool with me, other than me just like being a drummer and a musician, going to watch YouTube and listen to whatever, I have to, listen to and ultimately get to my original music. And it seems that all this stuff is going on and on and on. And it's kind of like, you got to be kidding me. And now it seems to be like an entire nation of like, replicated crap that's maybe only imitating a U.S. patent. Has some idea of like a black hole in space exploration, representing some governmental structures, a boycott and embargo, presenting the clearance issue on a daily basis. And, I've mentioned it before, maybe I don't even know what fraud is really what it is on a continual basis of an eternal treasury on an international level. I mean, maybe I just don't even know, what fraud is, at all. Seem to be continually some idea, like, nonstop, my music equipment, some, like, nut walking inside my home that seem to have every freaking key known to mankind on the entire planet within walking distance of, like, where I'm at, like, right now in Pearland. And it's really getting beyond, so, like, far beyond, like, not cool. It's, like, unreal, not funny. And really, So, like, in any case, all this is going on, and it seemed to be whether or not if ultimately some issue, like me being a musician, is maybe some idea, maybe someone else is not. And is it really that I'm a musician and maybe someone else is not? Or I like singing and listening to radio and it's kind of like what I do? Or is it maybe something about Univision and some idea of like KLOL on Lovett Street being taken over by some Latin American radio station? Is it really that Univision has presented something of Latin America in that way? Is it really that I don't know what like is all around me? Is it that I'm not from like Latin America? Or is it that maybe some idea of a degree level is manufactured the whole entire area here in Brazoria County area in Pearland, Texas? In that way, ultimately even getting to like religious issues of like involving Muslim or the Persian Gulf, and all the information on world news that seem to be like even involving, presidential terms in office, identifying what seem to be only now, only like the Star Day representing like 2 Delta forces, something of Deep Star 6, some idea of like information that would only identify maybe an Abraham Lincoln like night vision shuttle government Stargate program, or the information that's presented by Barack Obama. Seemingly, ultimately, even, dating back all the way back to every presidential term in office since the day I was born, seemed to be the potential of, like, grandfather corporate law of retroactive presidential administration. And the factors between, like, Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt seem to be pretty much a big deal about, the Roosevelt New Deal Act, and the difference between New Deal being 64 and New Deal Act being 88, and the difference between New Deal being 64 and HTTP:// or un-American or Israel, or some idea of Christianity as a 6-point star, or a 6-point being the idea of like Trump or California as a 6-point, or 2 delta forces as an electronic schematic symbol of a triangle combined, being some idea like Deep Star 6 and some Ocean 2 ocean or not to ocean thing, identifying information. It seemed to be somewhere between Barack Obama's information being presented on world news, local news, and national news involving Al Qaeda as compared to the information in the book Secrets of the Temple, identifying Latin terminology that seemed to be identifying the U.S. dollar below the equator in the book Secrets of the Temple, how the Federal Reserve runs the country. And also even a Tony, Orlando, and Don song, Tie a Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree. There seem to be, even packages from like Amazon.com and a bunch of yellow ribbons. And I'm so automatically thinking that way of audio production. My whole entire life. It's really what I've always done in my spare time, and I'm a drummer, okay? It's almost automatic that I have an immediate, blink of an eye, reference in my mind of some song that's identifying, some kind of issue that before wasn't even my way of thinking at all. Seemingly quite a bit the way I think now. And the thing with this is that, in between all the presidents that seem to be identifying factors at a political science level as compared to some idea, maybe what would only present maybe the idea of eternal treasuries at a scale that would, be some idea of geographic controlled issues. Seemed to be some of the information that ultimately had got to the Pulse Club in Orlando. And it seemed to be the thing about that one Pulse Club in Orlando that identifies the Persian Gulf and Latin America as some idea of some spiritually condemning factors of a religious issue that originate something like in my mind automatically beyond far not cool, okay? But it seemed to be that one location, and automatically in my mind it seemed to be the location about the information that's being identified on world news involving Barack Obama identifying somebody did Al Qaeda in the Persian Gulf as compared to the thought of his own words during his presidential administration, all the way back that really all the way in my mind automatically to the JFK thing, and hopefully even the information back during JFK and Jackie Onassis and the information of my friend Flick. On the Atlantic side, okay, there's an eccentric triangle, okay, called the Bermuda Triangle. Yet in international law and economics, the eccentric triangle is about plane horizons as compared to the pie chart in business law. The eccentric triangle is really international law of importing and exporting, identifying plane horizons. Not necessarily the Bermuda Triangle, although it is a screensaver of 2 eccentric triangles that seem to be the factor of ocean to ocean or not to ocean, or the thought of the movie Ocean's 12 has openly gotten to the point of, through a lot of analytical and symbolic and alphanumeric linguistic, it's really gotten to the idea of difference between Persian Gulf and Al Qaeda, and the misappropriation and allocation. It's kind of all this information. It seemed to be going even before high school, really, and realizing that I was hearing that terminology, didn't recognize it as what I'm talking about now, and really was that before I even realized, who's in my car at lunch, during high school. Similarly, the idea of a lot of information that was just, really wasn't the issue then, and really was from the very beginning the issue that I'm talking about now, from 1982, my senior year, and now this is the year 2025, okay? I'm at the age of 61 now, okay? And it seemed to be going through a lot of information that certain factors, that long ago, it seemed before it is written of grandfathered corporate law, a retroactive presidential administration. Ignoring it would be maybe not having any kind of significance, or maybe ignoring her, the ability, to comprehend maybe a normal conversation, okay? It seemed to be whether or not if really Brazoria is representing the idea of a Colombian, or Columbia Pictures, maybe the thought of maybe a non-degreed issue of high school, considered as a state of grace, of an associate's degree, and it's kind of like, you got to be kidding me. Missouri is like only 90, and it's like one person. Does that include like an endorsement of an entire employment history? As like one person being an individual, as like a Colombian and Brazilian, like maybe not know what having fair use is. Maybe it's an endorsement that might be maybe a silent partnership of their own signature being used as a 1099, and not even have a clue about their own, idea of like just signing their own endorsement, their entire employment history. Or, some idea of like having fair use but not claiming ownership of the rights. I mean, and the who knows anyway form is hopefully, really some idea like maybe neglect based upon lack of experience of like a foreknowledge of performance monitoring. Is really what it really always gets to anyway. So like any case, so like, if that's ultimately getting to be the only issue of Brazoria being the idea of like Columbia Pictures impersonating the Statue of Liberty or the Eurodollar, or importing and exporting as maybe a pie chart as compared to what it really is a plain horizon of an eccentric triangle of importing and exporting, not necessarily the idea of maybe segregated factors of degree level or non-degree level of vice president network and immigration custom enforcement. So anyway, it ultimately gets to whether or not if only the idea of GMC raising a bar is ultimately getting to a baptism of Wilkes Barre, Pennsylvania. And a 90 degree, what seemed to be the colon is really, maybe the thought of maybe a 90 degree as maybe the idea of like a pi r squared being 2 double forward slashes being 22.5 being 45. And the E equal MC squared, the pi r squared being like a total of like 90 degrees as a quadrant, identifying, the idea of like international financial management as globalization as the 90 degree. Hopefully, the colon, the double forward slash is really that. The colon in 9 degrees simply and easily can simply be, the double forward slash of the colon. Yet, 22.5 combined is 45 degrees, yet pi r squared that way. And the E equal MC squared is ultimately, 9 degrees of that just HTTP colon double forward slash being the ratio and identifying, that factor of pi r squared and E equal MC squared, ultimately getting to the exponential quotients of powers of multiplication beyond the idea of monetary and domestic aggregates that seem to be really the difference between the different design E and calculus going into quantum that has the structure of exponential quotients of powers of multiplication. And the thing about importing and exporting of patents, trademarks, and copyrights as compared to the thought of maybe constitutional law, freedom of speech, freedom of press, and having the right to assemble issue. So, ultimately, auditing legal media seems to be really what the real issue is. And really, well, who knows anyway? Like everyone on, like, YouTube.com, you can see me at my channel, WadeASVPriddy, PRDDY, at YouTube.com. But, is it really getting to the fact? I haven't heard a word yet. To this day, and ultimately it seems to be whether or not if, nonstop, if this Delta Force is going to be continuing the issue of a novice attempt to have some idea of a relationship beyond some transparency of falsely granting a screensaver. It's like, wow, it's really good seeing you. Huh. Yeah. So it seemed to be the thing about Babylon and some novice ideas, some black color code of like the 10 Commandments and some like pagan idolatry, some idea of FDIC claims is like, what erection is in construction as compared to, structure and anatomy, okay? Or, Jesus said he knew before the foundations of the earth and apply some practical application of symbolic representation, ultimately getting to a telepathic StarISBorn and like building like an entire like new eternal treasury. Yet, someone wanting to serve milk and cookies, ratifying, codifying law, like some idea of some publishers clearinghouse sweepstakes or some, state of graces. Maybe I still hadn't heard a word about any of it yet, okay? But, really? Who are you trying to kid? For real, okay? Is really what it's getting to. And ultimately, the idea of that immigration custom enforcement or some idea of like manufacturing relationship or some ideas and having fair use of maybe only what human capital means is something beyond, the kernel and partition involving, saying software is ultimately what it's getting to. And whether or not if the only issue of a kernel involving television programming is a data restriction is on the idea of what relation only means is maybe some idea of maybe what you mean? You mean that's just Latin? Or carbon, that's just a carbon footprint? Some idea of like what relation means, having myself to, like, for myself? Are you kidding me? As a controlled issue? or is that some like pagan idolatry representing some black color code or constitutional law and state statutes annotated? Some idea of pagan idolatry is some novice attempt to have a relationship, and like I'm 61 years of age, and Pearland is just some idea of like relation and like diapers in Babylon and Pearland, Texas. I mean, are you kidding me? You know, it seemed to be like some subconscious level, some subliminal idiot, you know, continually, seemingly, you know, referring to like, you know, what it means as, I mean, so like, what's that supposed to mean? What is it that gee, I'm glad you're there for me. Are you kidding me? Are you really there for me? Well, you know, it's really good to know that. Yeah, I know you mean well, right? In any case, so like, yeah, so like, it seemed to be really whether or not if immigration custom enforcement is just the idea of whether or not if a boycott and embargo is only representing some idea, some spiritually gifted value of like, you know, purgatory as compared to a boycott and embargo. You kidding me? Some pagan idolatry of like Egypt and some like black hole space exploration representing what relation, when relationship is not really going to be this issue? Or wait a minute, or is that the purgatory awaiting re-entering heaven issue like a boycott and embargo and wait a minute and now it's like, wow, I'm there for you. Really, am I there for you? Like with the when and where of like who knows anyway form. As a high school publishers, American Family Publishers Schoolhouse, it's really good city. Are you sure? So like it's really getting to really the publisher in Columbia, Missouri being what's some idea of a high school yearbook as a method of banking, as whether or not if it's an endorsement as some defector seeking AMC, as a 1099, as a carbon footprint absentee voting. And like Jim Neighbors is like, you know, like with Goober as a gubernatorial, like a electoral candidate for some, you know, Elmer Fudd crap. Are you kidding me? Yeah. Well, you know. Well, anyway, you know, I'm going to bypass my attitude about that right there. Okay. But it seemed to be whether or not if television programming is ultimately, you know, providing some idea of what political science only, you know, has to offer, as some idea of a degree level beyond maybe the thought of maybe the aggregates as some ideas as purgatory combined with a boycott and embargo, only representing monetary and domestic as aggregates. Of the three, there seem to be, you know, maybe not necessarily the idea of a commercial venue of living quarters of gross national product. Seemingly the thing of that's really, you know, beyond the thought of a circuit of a Stargate program. So it ultimately seems to be whether or not if really if Brazoria is only presenting what seems to be the grandfathered corporate laws, retroactive presidential administration. And it seemed to be like, you know, the thing about it, like right now, as far as like my direction in linguistic alphanumerics and symbolic and analytical, it seemed to be the symbolic representation and the Boolean chart, ultimately getting to the west wing of the White House and the blue wing and the W of PG-13 rating, yet the G of the B in venue seemed to be the only thing about being taken there and actually being there, being my thought of actually being the G and B in venue about human civil rights. Some idea, you know, going beyond the thought of like being itemized as on the expenditure side of human capital, of investment terminology, beyond some idea of a deed restriction maybe that might only involve maybe a kernel as a partition of television programming, or what a deed restriction is in SAN software of an acronym as compared to a storage area network or a securities and annuities network. An acronym of SAN software of International Financial Management. That's really what it gets to. Or the difference between AJAX, you know, language involving, you know, the thought somewhere between the AJAX language and the idea of like, I'll actually have to think about it. It seemed to be the deal about Oracle and Apple and the Apple iPhone SE between the ERISA statute and the IRA, and the similarities of non-taxable income that presents all the factors between constitutional law as compared to corporate and business law, or domestically clause issues that seem to be involving the Stargate program of symbolic and analytical, the Boolean chart, sequencing characterization in sets of 6, of it like a Better Business Bureau bird baptism in Route 66. I mean, for real. And Michael Jackson, it's easy as 1, 2, 3, ABC, 1, 2, 3, you and me thing about, you know, ABC being 1, 2, 3 is really 6. And Route 66 is pi squared E, MC squared. And, the thing about, MJ and Michael Jackson being 23, ultimately, the Sigma Alpha Delta Kappa Phi thing. And right now, it's kind of like it's got to the, whether or not if that's really even the acronyms at this point. Only because I know that networking of available information is really what I'm talking about. Anything maybe other than that would be seeing something a little bit beyond maybe of what I haven't even heard of yet. And it seemed to be possibly even that Sigma Alpha Delta Kappa Phi thing of like some of the degrees of like fraternities and sororities of like, degree graduates of whether or not if only identifying a Delta Force is only the acronym of some of the highest levels that seem to be involving, some idea of like world powers involving, the thought of like certain factors that seem to be involving the Nimitz class as compared to like the United States Supreme Court identifying, minutes in the courtroom as actual military legal proceedings as auditing live. There seems to be a thing about international financial management, the quadrants that way, and globalization of a 90 degree that identifies the quadrants of like architecture, platform, embedding, encryption, and all this information is seen to be like an interchanging, interfacing, interconnectivity, interdepartmental, and the difference between a circuit or a Stargate or VSAT communication as compared to what seemed to be an issue of like the American Express Bluebird card and the gold bar in my mind automatically the Chico stick, the Freddie Prinze Chico stick of ethnic background, yet a MP4 on a 4-digit security code on the front and the MP3 like 3 on the back, and all that gold stuff in my mind is like the ethnic background of like being baptized during the gold rush and on the stagecoach of Wells Fargo. And it seemed to be the thing about McDonald's Golden Arches that way, as well as like Freddie Prinze Chico and a Man thing about that well-balanced Chico stick and the ethnic background and raising a bar. Yeah, so it seemed to be like ultimately that it seemed to be like as during a lifespan, it seemed to be the thing about Wilkes Barre, Pennsylvania being used as some idea as maybe identifying supplemental security income as involving a chosen day of a baptism. Ultimately, it seemed to be the Six Flag baptism on June 14th, 1992, the Mormon Church of Friendswood, Texas. And all the information that I've been talking about at WadeASVPriddy, PRDDY, YouTube.com. And it seemed that the Social Security Administration introducing supplemental security income, and my thought about, going beyond the thought of like the misappropriation allocation of Mississippi in that way of an international superstar, the supplemental security income, and the similarities that way on a continental level of, a whole bunch of having a right to assemble issues about that. Yeah, somewhere between the Reese statute and the IRA presenting like the Apple iPhone SE between Apple and Oracle. And it seemed to be like really even certain factors involving Oracle that Cybele has some idea of maybe what only the Persian Gulf might only mean to, like maybe it's Cybele and the thought of Egypt as maybe the pagan idolatry involving the black bird of Egypt, yet maybe the thing about Moses and 71 in Pearland is maybe the Babylon issue of a pagan idolatry only would an opposite attempt and Babylon would only mean to maybe babysitting an entire lifespan. So like any case, yeah, so like saying to me, the idea of what controlled reference only means as maybe only whether or not if monetary domestic only represents maybe what having the right to assemble only means between monetary and domestic as a PG-13 rating. Not necessarily the individual, the thought of maybe going beyond the idea of parental guidance or presidential governors in a way that would only represent maybe the idea of grandfathered corporate law as retroactive presidential administration, only identifying maybe only what neighborhood mean that way. And it seemed to be the issue between like purgatory as some idea of waiting, re-entering heaven as a waiting period as compared to a boycott embargo or some like black hole in space exploration, Abraham Lincoln Night Vision Shuttle Government Stargate program, or what the partition only means in my mind as a kernel, or some idea, there seemed to be really the difference between a K9 unit between like W television and like K television. And it, really, it's ultimately going to be that, like anyway, for like anyone, no matter what. If anyone hadn't felt the effect of anything, and it's like it's not significant, well then it's not. But for me, it's exactly, something I'm really not ignoring. Thinking that really the only issue between television programming or auditing live legal media is only the thought of maybe someone else thinking that who knows anyway for him, you know, what the who knows anyway for him really is or is not. And the thing with it is that ultimately, you know, the thought of maybe, you know, favoritism, that maybe it's only the idea of maybe you know, getting some like secret attention that really, you got to be kidding me. And I mean, really, ultimately, it gets to whether or not of what having fair use of an intellectual easement is, whether that's only an ergonomic factor or some idea of only what lifespan means is depreciation between monetary and domestic, as compared to appreciation of lifespan. Litigation is such a corporate term involving annuity. It only identifies whether or not an FDIC claim of suppression or loss prevention is only the monetary and domestic of, like, you know, on the negative side, as compared to electronic annuity of appreciation. It seemed to be the idea, you know, going beyond the thought of maybe only what lifespan really is of annuity, as compared to settlements seem to be, you know, beyond the toilet, beyond settlement of the toilet. And, you know, raising a bar, GMC's raising a bar, and all that Alpha America of 23 and Michael Jackson and the MJ of PG-13 rating is really ultimately what it seemed to be going to. And it's already going on like an hour and 55 seconds right now. You know what? I think I'm going to go ahead and take a break, get this uploaded, and maybe, hey, it's break time. Yeah. So, like, anyway, yeah. So, like, hopefully I'll be setting my drum set up and actually getting, you know, the Strata Blue like real soon. Hopefully that's going to happen. But it seemed to be like $4 of performance monitoring has the idea of like some, like, you know, economic factors and involving like supplemental security income, and, you know, I don't mean to sound like economic plea bargain, Ponzi scheming, raffling, voucher, you know, auctioneering, clearance, and warehousing as maybe, you know, some supplemental security income beneficiary, you know, managing the factors of, like, you know, some like multi-billion-dollar like issues that seem to be like, oh, even ultimately, you know, some information that seem to be even, you know, the combining a student loan with a Pell Grant. Ultimately, seemingly the idea in my mind, it's almost like chasing like Capital One on the west side of Houston, on West Loop 610, not far from the Galleria, representing, you know, some factors between, you know, combining a student loan with a Pell Grant. It's almost like, you know, almost like the World Trade Center, what seemed to be like monopolizing capitalization, having fair use of family law in that way. And, you know, all the practical application, and, you know, the idea that raising a bar has been the idea maybe including a baptism. I mean, so for real, it seemed to be the Six Flag baptism, about a national landmark. And like generations of biblical prophecy actually really being a phenomenally huge secret of grandfathered corporate law, of retroactive presidential administration, is really the way I really see the Roosevelt New Deal Act involving OPEC and the International Electronic Engineering, and all the factors seem to be, you know, the real issue between like Texas and New Mexico power, as compared to what Centerpoint only seems to be the difference between District of Columbia being some idea of Columbia Pictures impersonating the Statue of Liberty, is really all it seems to be like right now about that. The Roosevelt New Deal Act, it seemed to be, you know, the real issue between Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt, 6 presidential terms in office, representing the idea of Six Flags. There's so many factors involving six, it's unreal. Even Route 66, or the thought of combining a 6-point star, or the Better Business Bureau bird bath baptism as compared to Route 66, and I mean a bird bath for real. And, you know, that book Six is Simple How the Predator Runs the Country, and the Psychic War, America's Foremost Psychic Spy, and the cover up, yeah, the top secret, unidentified Better Business Bureau bird bath baptism. It's the unidentified flying object. It's the Better Business Bureau bird bath baptism. The cover up of the top secret, yeah, Better Business Bureau bird bath baptism of Route 66 is really what it is. Huh. And it seemed to be the Wilkes Bar of Pennsylvania, representing some idea of the bar in a baptismal booth, and the handrail representing like one of the double forward slashes. I mean, of a baptism, I mean for real. And the bar, like, you know, that when getting baptized, I mean for real, putting the feet up under there. And so, you know, like the pastor, preacher, or, you know, whoever's like doing the baptism can maintain their balance, as well as, you know, the person being dunked in the water, about, you know, everything about its representation as Christianity. But it seemed to be, I mean, now it seemed to be like one major requirement on a continental level of like June 14th, 1992. Mormon Church, yes. Yes, Springfield, Texas. Yeah, it really seems to be exactly that day. On Saturday morning, Flag Day, Saturday SAT thing about the highest possible score of 2,400. So like anyway, that's what I have to say about it right now. It's already going on like an hour and 4 minutes and 45 seconds. So I'm gonna take a break now. Okay, there it is. Yeah.